Inheritance. Erwin Thompson was struggling to make ends meet when he suddenly received an envelope from an unfamiliar address. It contained a key, a written note, and a signed will of his father, whom he'd never met. The letter stated that he left him with a property when he passed away, and he could move in any time he wished. Baffled and unsure, he decided to see the place out of curiosity. It was located far beyond the suburbs and away from the populated areas. As he went, he found himself standing in front of an old house that was far too big for a single man. For a broke individual who could hardly afford his rent, this unexpected inheritance was an opportunity for a new beginning. However, this sudden stroke of luck had more surprises than he could have anticipated. The death of his father seemed like a blessing in disguise, but it was nothing more than an embodiment of nightmare in real life. The house was kept relatively well despite of its obvious age, and it looked more like a gallery instead of a comfortable home to live in. All the wooden furniture were antique, with elaborate Baroque carvings, and the walls were filled with surreal paintings and exotic ornaments from different parts of the world. Erwin's father, Wilhelm Thompson, was an archaeologist who received several awards for his historical finds, and he took home some of the relics that he unearthed. The glass shelves rode in the hallway were full of artistically carved stones, and there were pieces of ivories that appeared to be articles with spiritual significance. Wilhelm's vast collection of these things suggested that he was quite fond of olden beliefs. Wilhelm was always traveling due to the nature of his work, and perhaps it was the strong dedication to his career that made him leave Erwin before he was even born. His mother never heard of him ever since he left. Their romantic relationship was short-lived, and it wasn't a substantial one either. The archaeologist was practically a stranger to his own son, that it took a moment before he was able to recognize his name in the letter. It didn't even mention when or how he died. His late mother barely spoke of him for obvious reasons, and Erwin grew up without even knowing his father's face. He tried to know more about him while looking at all the things around his home, but the paintings and vast collections of trinkets could only provide a vague hint about his true character. Another thing he noticed was the lack of family pictures or any form of memento that might suggest Wilhelm's familial relations. Erwin was grateful for the unexpected inheritance that he received from his father, and he grew more curious about his life and his works. However, he would soon realize that Wilhelm's passion for the old ways ran deeper and darker than he could have possibly imagined. Erwin began to clean the place up to settle in, and it was then when he discovered some disturbing things. Wilhelm's home had 4 bedrooms, a library, an office, a big dining area, and a spacious living room that could easily host a small feast. Cleaning such a big place was quite a chore, but a broke man wouldn't complain for such a task, since it was the first time for him to have a place that he could call his own. However, this also included his father's vast collection of bizarre things. When he had a closer look at the stuff that William had hoarded throughout the years, he realized that some of them were made of actual human remains. The tribal wind instruments that were wrapped on braided hair were made of arm bones, and one of which was a preserved humerus that was carved and turned into a flute. A small acoustic drum that was lavishly ornate with precious stones was made of a stretched skin, and the drumsticks themselves were a pair of femur bones with intricate carvings of ethnic symbols. It was not just the collection of his father that he discovered around his new home. He also found some inexplicable scratches on the floor and across the walls. They looked like claw marks of an animal, but the marks were too big for a raccoon, nor any common critter that often snuck into houses from time to time. Aside from the size, the markings were also present in odd areas. There were scratches at the corners of the ceiling that he couldn't even reach. But despite all of these things, Erwin remained optimistic and turned a blind eye for the sake of starting a new life. As he moved on to clean the library, he finally saw the face of his father for the first time. In a folded newspaper that was published 5 years ago, there was a photo of Wilhelm in an article he was featured in to commemorate his contributions in the field. In a black and white picture, there was a young boy standing beside his father, but the article did not mention who he was. Out of exhaustion for cleaning such a massive place on his own, Erwin fell asleep while resting on the couch. For the very first sleep in his new home, he was greeted by a very peculiar nightmare. With a blurry view of the library where he fell asleep, he saw a silhouette of a man standing at the doorway. As he batted his eyes to clear up his view, he heard a strange noise that sounded like claws clicking against the wooden floor. Right behind the vague image of the man, a shadow of a beast slowly appeared. This hound-like entity suddenly stood on its 2 feet, and it lunged towards him. Erwin's body jolted off the couch as he woke up. He was stricken by terror, and the first view he saw when he opened his eyes was the same view that he had in his nightmare. It felt and looked like it wasn't a dream at all. Everything was exactly the same, except from the man and the beast at the doorway. After a couple of days, Erwin applied and was hired as a waiter at the town's local diner. The community in this area was relatively small, and it was clear that the residents knew one another as most of them greeted each other while walking into the establishment. Everything was mundane, as it should be, until the local doctor came around and noticed him. While taking his order, he kept on staring at Erwin's face. When he asked why, the doctor said that he looked quite familiar, despite of meeting him for the first time. Apparently, the doctor had tended to Wilhelm's medical needs when he was still around. Erwin properly introduced himself once he heard his father's name. He mentioned that Wilhelm had already passed away, and he didn't seem surprised by this news. The doctor said that Wilhelm was suffering from a terminal disease, but refused to be admitted in the hospital while he was still alive. Wilhelm had a motor neuron disease, and the doctor said that he was already in really bad shape when he last saw him a couple of years ago. He was already bedridden and could not even lift a finger. This particular detail made Erwin quite confused. He told him that he had received a letter along with his father's last will just a week ago, and that he had just recently moved into his inherited house. The doctor paused for a while to think, and then he said that it must have been his father's assistant Julian who had sent him the letter. Erwin remembered the photo of the young man he saw with his father in the newspaper article, and he assumed that the doctor was referring to this person. He wondered why this assistant did not personally reach out to him when Wilhelm died. He asked the doctor if he knew a way to contact Julian so he could know more about his father, but the doctor did not have any contact nor any other information. He only said that he was a strange individual who was always with the late archaeologist. This mysterious young man would soon reveal himself, and Erwin would have wished that he didn't. The cloud of mystery that surrounded Wilhelm Thompson just grew even thicker as Erwin discovered more things about him. He looked for the office who notarized his late father's will, and he was told that the document was not authenticated. This meant that the house he was living in was not legally passed on to him. He asked a few more people in the diner if they knew anything about his father's passing, but nobody knew about it. Wilhelm's reputable stature and unfriendly demeanor had made it extremely difficult for any townspeople to interact with him. There wasn't any record in the closest hospitals, and there wasn't any tombstone with his name at the cemetery. It seemed as if he had just suddenly disappeared. Out of desperation, he started to thoroughly search his father's belongings in the hope that he might find any clue. He tried to search any record of his last travel, the last person he talked to, his assistant's contacts, or just about anything that could lead to his whereabouts. Exhausted and frustrated, Erwin decided to take a break when the night came. As he walked across the hallway while heading to his room, he noticed a strange sound coming from the library. He opened the door to check what it was, and the first thing that caught his eyes was the portion of the wall slid open. There was a secret room hidden behind the walls. When he was able to walk in, he heard the strange sound once again coming from above him. As he turned his head, his eyes widened and his knees buckled because of what he saw. He was far too terrified to move or scream as this half-man, half-beast crawled vertically across the wall to approach him. His arms and legs were covered in black fur, and his face was of a human with an extended jaw like the muzzle of a hound. His ears were long, and his claws were sharp. This was the same creature that Erwin had seen in his dream. As he moved closer and closer, he was able to recognize his face. This otherworldly fiend was no other than his father's assistant, Julian. Before he could react and run away, he jumped towards him and knocked him out cold. Wilhelm Thompson had learned a lot of things in his field of work, But what piqued his interest the most was his discovery of ancient scriptures and the supernatural practices of the olden days. He studied the undocumented beliefs of lost tribes, and what solidified these seemingly far-fetched lore into his own faith was when he came across a child who could transform himself into a beast. He groomed and adapted this child to be an apprentice, and then he named him Julian. When he fell ill and the modern medicine could not help him, he decided to perform an old ritual to aid his deteriorating state. He needed to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to restore his well-being, and so he decided to lure his only son, Erwin. They waited for the right time. When the moon was enveloped by darkness, it was then that they could make the sacrifice. As Erwin regained his consciousness, he found himself tied in front of an altar with an idol of a winged demon. The room was filled with smoke from the burning herbs that surrounded him, and right beside him was a frail old man who could only move his eyes to look at him. Erwin began to cry as he desperately tried to scream, but his mouth was tightly packed with a bundle of leaves that were also burning. Julian began to chant with a language that he never heard of, and Erwin couldn't do anything but to stare at the old man when he realized that it was Wilhelm Thompson himself. The smoke grew thicker, and Erwin's energy began to fade for some reason. When the chanting was over, Julian drove a blade made of bone right through Erwin's chest. The last thing he saw was his father sitting up from the floor. Soaked in his own son's blood, Wilhelm turned his head to Erwin with a grin on his face. A few days later, there were witnesses who saw Wilhelm Thompson walking out of his house with his assistant. However, the man who claimed to be his son and also spread the rumor about his death was never seen again.